The soft buzz of my phone on the nightstand stirred me from the depths of sleep. I reached out, eyes half open, expecting a late-night work email or maybe a message from one of the guys. But when I saw the name, unknown number, flash on the screen, my heart sank. Curiosity, laced with unease, pulled me fully awake. I hesitated for a moment, then swiped to open the message. A video file. I stared at the screen, dread filling my chest. With trembling fingers, I pressed play. The first thing I saw was her, the woman I had spent the last 15 years of my life with, Laura. My beautiful, loyal, loving wife. Or so I thought. The footage was grainy, probably taken from a security camera. But there was no mistaking her face, her smile, the way she ran her fingers through her blonde hair, a nervous habit I knew all too well. And there was no mistaking the man she was with, Brian, my best friend. They were in a hotel room, a place she had claimed to be staying for a marketing conference just last week. I felt a cold fury rise within me as I watched them embrace. The video capturing every sordid detail of their betrayal. The room started to spin, and I realized I hadn't been breathing. With a roar of rage, I hurled my phone against the wall. The screen shattered, but the image of them together was burned into my mind. I felt sick to my stomach, my hands shaking uncontrollably. How long had this been going on? How many times had they laughed at me behind my back? The fury inside me was like nothing I had ever felt before. It was primal, consuming. And in that moment, one thought became crystal clear: I would make them both pay. Laura wasn't going to get away with this. Not this time. I spent the next few days in a fog of disbelief, anger simmering just below the surface. I replayed the video in my mind over and over again, each time feeling a fresh wave of nausea and rage. But I knew I had to keep it together. I couldn't confront Laura, not yet. If I acted too soon, I might lose my chance to bring them both down. So, I waited. I watched. I became the husband she expected me to be, masking my rage with a calm exterior. I bought her flowers, cooked her dinner, and even planned a weekend getaway for us. Laura was none the wiser, smiling and laughing as though nothing had changed. It disgusted me to see how easily she could lie to my face. I started keeping tabs on her, paying closer attention to her schedule. She had always been good at covering her tracks, but now that I knew what to look for, the signs were glaringly obvious. Late nights at the office, sudden trips out of town, each one was a rendezvous with Brian. I documented everything: the calls, the texts, the hotel receipts. I needed as much ammunition as possible for when the time came to confront her. Brian, too, had no idea what was coming. He still called me like nothing was wrong, talking about sports, and asking how Laura was doing. The audacity of it made my blood boil. But I played along, laughing at his jokes, pretending to be the oblivious friend. All the while, I was carefully laying the groundwork for their downfall. I contacted a lawyer, setting up a meeting to discuss my options. Protecting my assets was the first priority. I started moving money out of our joint accounts, setting up new ones in my name only. I had to make sure that when I made my move, Laura would be left with nothing. The nights were the hardest. Lying in bed next to her, pretending to sleep, while all I wanted to do was scream. But I kept my anger in check. Knowing that every day I waited brought me closer to the moment when I could finally unleash the full force of my revenge. It was only a matter of time before Laura's world would come crashing down around her. And when it did, I would be there to watch every moment of her destruction. The days blurred together as I meticulously carried out my plan, the weight of my secret knowledge pushing me forward. Laura remained oblivious, basking in the attention I was giving her. To her, I was the perfect husband, attentive, loving, and devoted. Little did she know that each smile I offered, each affectionate touch, was a carefully crafted performance, designed to lull her into a false sense of security. Every morning, I made her coffee just the way she liked it, 2 sugars and a splash of cream. I kissed her goodbye as she left for work, telling her how much I loved her, and how I couldn't wait to see her later. In the evenings, I would surprise her with her favorite takeout or cooked dinner at home, creating an atmosphere of warmth and normalcy. We would sit together on the couch, her head resting on my shoulder, watching TV as if nothing had changed. But behind those moments of domestic bliss, I was slowly dismantling her life. I continued to siphon money out of our accounts, careful to leave just enough so that she wouldn't notice. I transferred ownership of the house to a trust in my name only, ensuring that when the time came, she would have no claim to it. I even began selling off some of our joint assets, furniture, jewelry, anything that wasn't nailed down. Laura didn't seem to care. She was too busy sneaking off to meet Brian to notice the little things disappearing. Brian was just as clueless. We still met up for drinks or watched the game together, and I kept up the charade of being his friend. The irony wasn't lost on me. Brian, who thought he was so clever, who thought he could steal my wife and my life out from under me, was unknowingly helping me put the final pieces of my plan in place. He was going to pay just as much as Laura when this was all over. One evening, after another one of Laura's late nights at the office, I decided to test her. I asked her how her day was, watching her closely as she spun her web of lies. She didn't even flinch, didn't hesitate as she told me about a fake meeting with a client and how exhausted she was. I felt the anger rise within me, but I forced it down, keeping my expression neutral. Instead, I suggested that we take a weekend trip to the mountains, just the two of us, to relax and reconnect. Her eyes lit up at the idea. And she readily agreed. She had no idea that the trip was just another piece of my puzzle, a way to throw her off the scent of what was really happening. The more secure she felt in our relationship, the harder the fall would be when I finally revealed the truth. As she drifted off to sleep that night, her head resting on my chest, I stared up at the ceiling, my mind racing. The moment was coming, the moment when I would turn her world upside down. And as I listened to her steady breathing, I knew that I was ready for whatever came next. With the weekend getaway looming, I focused on finalizing the details of my plan. I contacted my lawyer again, ensuring that everything was in place for the divorce papers to be served the moment I gave the signal. He assured me that my preparations were airtight. Laura wouldn't see a dime more than what the law required, and even that would be minimal. The weekend trip itself was a strategic move. I wanted to create a final memory for Laura. Something she would cling to when everything fell apart. It would be the ultimate contrast, our last happy moment together before I shattered the illusion she had been living in. The mountains had always been a special place for us, a retreat from the world. But this time, it would serve as the stage for my final act of deception. Before we left, I made sure to collect the last pieces of evidence I needed. I had started recording our phone calls, capturing every lie she told me about her whereabouts. I even managed to install a small camera in her car, which recorded her meeting Brian in a secluded spot just outside of town. The footage was clear and undeniable. There would be no escape for her when I confronted her with the truth. On the morning of our trip, I packed our bags, making sure to include a few surprises. Among the clothes and toiletries, I hid a stack of printed photos, the incriminating evidence of her infidelity. I also included the divorce papers, ready for her signature. I wanted everything to be perfectly timed. I wanted her to see the photos before I handed her the documents. The shock would be overwhelming. The drive to the mountains was peaceful, almost surreal. Laura was in high spirits, chatting away about how much she was looking forward to hiking and spending time together. I nodded and smiled, playing along, all the while knowing that the clock was ticking down to the moment when everything would change. We arrived at the cabin in the late afternoon. It was secluded, surrounded by tall pines, and with a breathtaking view of the valley below. I had chosen this place specifically for its isolation, no neighbors, no distractions. Just us, alone with the truth. As the sun began to set, we settled in for the evening. Laura was relaxed, happy, and completely unaware of what was about to happen. I poured us both a glass of wine, making a toast to our time together. She smiled at me, her eyes filled with affection, and I felt a pang of something. Was it guilt? Regret, but it was fleeting? I had come too far to turn back now. After dinner, as we sat in front of the fire, I decided it was time. I reached into my bag, pulling out the stack of photos. Laura looked at me, puzzled, as I handed them to her. "What's this?" she asked, her voice light, curious. "Just something I thought you should see," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. She flipped through the first few photos, her smile fading as she realized what she was looking at. The color drained from her face, and her hands began to tremble. "Jason. I can explain," she stammered, her eyes wide with panic. But I was done listening to her lies. I reached into the bag again and pulled out the divorce papers, placing them on the table between us. "No explanations, Laura. Just sign," I said coldly, watching as the reality of the situation began to sink in for her. She looked at me, tears welling up in her eyes, but I felt nothing, no pity, no compassion. Only a grim satisfaction as I waited for her to realize that everything she thought she had was slipping away. Right in front of her eyes. Laura's hand hovered over the divorce papers, her eyes flitting back and forth between me and the damning photographs spread out on the table. The weight of the moment hung heavy in the air, thick with the tension of unspoken truths. She opened her mouth to speak, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, tears spilled over, tracing a path down her cheeks. "Jason, please. We can talk about this," she finally managed to say, her voice trembling. "Talk?" I replied, my tone colder than I intended. "What is there to talk about, Laura? You've been lying to me for years. I know everything." She looked down at the photos again, as if hoping they would somehow disappear. "It wasn't supposed to be like this. I didn't want to hurt you." I felt a bitter laugh rise in my throat. "Didn't want to hurt me? You've been betraying me with my best friend for years. How did you think this was going to end?" Laura shook her head, the tears now flowing freely. "It wasn't always like this. Jason. I don't even know how it happened. But I never stopped loving you." Her words, once so powerful, now felt hollow, meaningless. "Love?" I spat out the word like it was poison. "You don't get to use that word, not after everything you've done." I watched as she crumbled in front of me, her defenses shattered by the harsh reality she could no longer deny. There was a part of me, a small, distant part, that almost pitied her. But the anger I felt was too strong, too consuming to let any sympathy take hold. "I don't want to drag this out," I continued, my voice firm. "Just sign the papers, Laura. The sooner this is over, the better." For a moment, she looked like she might refuse, like she might try to fight for something. Our marriage, her dignity, I didn't know. But then, with a resigned sigh, she picked up the pen and scrawled her signature on the dotted lines. I could see the defeat in her eyes, the understanding that this was the end. When she finished, she pushed the papers back toward me, her hand shaking. "I'm sorry," she whispered, the words almost lost in the crackling of the fire. I stared at her for a long moment. The woman I had once loved was now a stranger to me. "Sorry doesn't fix this, Laura," I said quietly. "Nothing can." I gathered the papers, sliding them back into my bag. There was nothing left to say. The silence between us was suffocating, filled with all the things we could never undo. I stood up, needing to get away from her. From the cabin, from the wreckage of what our lives had become. "I'll stay in the guest room tonight," I said, turning to leave. "Jason," she called out, her voice desperate, pleading. But I didn't look back. I couldn't. I walked out of the room, the sound of her quiet sobs following me like a ghost. The next morning, I left the cabin early, the finality of what had happened with Laura weighing heavily on me. But there was still one more piece of business to take care of, Brian. I drove back into town. My thoughts a tangle of anger and anticipation. It was time to face him, to end this charade once and for all. I had arranged to meet Brian at our usual spot, a quiet bar on the edge of town where we often watched games together. He had no idea what was coming, still oblivious to the fact that I knew everything. I pulled into the parking lot, took a deep breath, and headed inside. Brian was already there, sitting at our usual table with a beer in hand. He greeted me with a smile, but I could see the faint lines of worry on his face. Maybe Laura had called him, tried to warn him, but he didn't know for sure what was happening. Not yet. "Hey, man, you look like you've had a rough night," he said as I sat down. "Everything okay?" I forced a smile, the rage I felt toward him boiling just beneath the surface. "Yeah, you could say that. Actually, I wanted to talk to you about something." Brian's smile faltered a bit, but he nodded. "Sure, what's up?" I took out my phone. The screen cracked from the night I had thrown it against the wall. But it still worked well enough for what I needed. I opened the gallery, found the video that had started all of this, and slid the phone across the table to him. "Watch this." Brian's eyes widened in confusion, but he picked up the phone and pressed play. I watched as the color drained from his face, his expression shifting from curiosity to horror as he realized what he was seeing. The silence between us was thick with tension, and when the video ended, he looked up at me, his face pale. "Jason, he started, but I cut him off. "Don't," I said sharply. "Don't you dare try to explain this to me." "I know everything, Brian. Everything." He swallowed hard, his eyes darting around the bar as if searching for an escape. "I didn't mean for it to happen. I don't know, man. It just happened." "Don't give me that bullshit," I snapped, my voice low but filled with venom. "You were supposed to be my best friend. You think you can just betray me and then brush it off like it's nothing?" "I'm sorry, Jason. I really am. It was a mistake, a terrible mistake," he said, desperation creeping into his voice. I leaned forward, my eyes locking onto his. "A mistake? You've been screwing my wife for years, Brian. That's not a mistake. That's a calculated, selfish choice. You betrayed me, over and over again, and you thought you could get away with it." He opened his mouth to say something, but I wasn't interested in his excuses. I was done listening. "I've already filed for divorce. Laura signed the papers last night. You're both going to get what you deserve." Brian's face fell, the reality of the situation finally sinking in. "Jason, please, we can work this out. We've been friends for too long to let it end like this." "Friends?" I spat out the word, filled with disgust. "You're no friend of mine, Brian. You're just another liar, another cheat. And as far as I'm concerned, we're done. For good." I stood up, the finality of my words hanging in the air. Brian looked up at me, his expression a mix of regret and fear. But I didn't care anymore. I had lost too much, and he was part of the reason why. Without another word, I turned and walked out of the bar, leaving Brian to deal with the consequences of his actions. I felt a strange sense of relief as I stepped outside, like a weight had been lifted off my shoulders. There was still a lot to sort out, and a lot of pain to process, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I could finally start to move on. As I got into my car and drove away, I knew that this chapter of my life was over. And while the scars would remain, I was ready to leave the betrayal behind and focus on what came next. Whatever that might be. The days following my confrontation with Brian were a blur of paperwork, meetings with my lawyer, and long, sleepless nights. The divorce proceedings moved swiftly, thanks to the airtight case I had built against Laura. There was no contest, no drawn-out battle. She knew she had lost. The house, the savings, the life we had built together, all of it now belonged to me. Laura was left with the bare minimum, a hollow victory in a war she never expected to fight. I hadn't heard from Brian since that day at the bar. He had tried calling me once, maybe twice, but I didn't answer. Whatever friendship we had was dead, buried beneath the weight of his betrayal. The thought of him, of what he and Laura had done, still made my blood boil, but I pushed it down, focusing instead on the practicalities of moving on. The house felt different now, quieter, emptier. Laura's absence was palpable, a void in the space we had once shared. I spent hours wandering through the rooms, memories clashing with the new reality. It was strange how quickly something familiar could turn foreign, how a home could become just a house. I started packing away her things, boxing up the remnants of our life together. Each item was a reminder of the years we had spent side by side, but it was also a reminder of the lies and the deceit that had poisoned everything. I found an old photo album tucked away in the back of a closet, covered in dust. Flipping through it, I saw the life we had once had, the smiles, the vacations, the moments of happiness that now felt like a cruel joke. There were photos of our wedding, Laura's smile radiant, mine genuine. I stared at those pictures, trying to reconcile the woman in them with the one who had destroyed everything we had. But I couldn't. That Laura no longer existed, if she ever had. I kept the album, though, placing it on a shelf in the living room. It was a reminder, not just of what had been lost, but of what I had survived. The betrayal, the pain, it had nearly broken me, but I was still standing. And now, with the divorce finalized and Laura out of my life, I was ready to start again. To rebuild. One night, as I sat alone in the living room, I poured myself a drink and stared out the window into the darkness. The silence was oppressive, but it was also peaceful, a stark contrast to the chaos that had consumed my life just weeks before. I took a sip of whiskey, letting the warmth spread through me, and allowed myself to think about the future, something I hadn't done in a long time. I had a new life to figure out. It wouldn't be easy, and the road ahead was uncertain, but it was mine to navigate. And for the first time in a long time, I felt a glimmer of hope, a sense that maybe, just maybe, things would be okay. Weeks passed, and slowly, life began to regain some semblance of normalcy. I threw myself into work, trying to fill the void that Laura's absence had left. My colleagues noticed the change in me, quieter, more reserved, but they didn't ask questions. I wasn't ready to talk about what had happened, and I appreciated their discretion. One Friday evening, as I was about to leave the office, my phone buzzed with an incoming call. I glanced at the screen, expecting it to be a work-related issue, but the number was unfamiliar. For a moment, I considered ignoring it, but something made me pick up. "Hello?" I answered, my voice wary. There was a pause on the other end. And then a voice I hadn't expected to hear. "Jason, it's Brian." I felt a surge of anger, the familiar bitterness rising in my chest. "What do you want, Brian?" I asked, my tone cold. "I need to talk to you," he said, his voice strained. "Please, just hear me out." I considered hanging up, but something in his voice made me pause. He sounded desperate, broken in a way I hadn't heard before. Against my better judgment, I decided to listen. "You've got 2 minutes," I said flatly. "I know I'm the last person you want to hear from." Brian began, his words tumbling out in a rush. "But I need you to know. I've lost everything. My job, my friends. Everyone turned their back on me when they found out what I did. I'm not asking for your forgiveness, because I know I don't deserve it. But I wanted you to know that I'm sorry, Jason. I'm truly, deeply sorry." I sat in silence, gripping the phone tightly. Part of me wanted to revel in his misery, to let him know that he was getting exactly what he deserved. But another part of me, a part one hadn't expected, felt a pang of something close to pity. "It's too late for apologies, Brian," I finally said, my voice devoid of emotion. "You made your choices, and now you have to live with them." "I know," he replied, his voice cracking. I needed to say it. I needed you to hear it from me, not because I want anything from you, but because it's the truth." There was another pause, and I could hear him struggling to keep it together. "I've been trying to figure out where it all went wrong. How I became the person who could do this to you. To both of you. I don't have any answers, Jason. All I know is that I screwed up the best thing I ever had, and now I'm paying for it. I didn't know what to say. The anger I had felt so strongly just moments before was still there, but it was mingled with something else, an uncomfortable recognition that Brian was just as lost as I had been. But I wasn't ready to let him off the hook. I appreciate the apology, I said, my voice firm. But it doesn't change what you did. You betrayed me, and you betrayed yourself. I hope you find a way to live with that. There was a long silence on the other end of the line, and for a moment, I thought Brian had hung up. But then he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. Goodbye, Jason. I hope you find peace. Before I could respond, the line went dead. I stared at the phone in my hand, the words echoing in my mind. Peace. It was something I hadn't thought about in a long time. Something I wasn't sure I knew how to find. But as I left the office and walked out into the cool evening air, I realized that maybe, just maybe, I was starting to. The conversation with Brian, as unexpected as it was, had brought a strange sense of closure. It didn't erase the pain, and it didn't make everything okay, but it was a step, a small step toward healing, toward moving on. I didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, I felt like I was ready to face it. A few more weeks passed, and the heaviness that had settled over my life after the divorce slowly began to lift. It wasn't immediate, healing never is, but it was noticeable. The anger and betrayal that had consumed me started to fade, replaced by a quiet determination to rebuild my life. One day, as I was cleaning out the last of Laura's belongings from the house, I found an old flyer from a local community center tucked between some papers in a drawer. It advertised a photography class. Something Laura had wanted us to do together but that we had never found the time for. I stared at it for a long moment, debating whether to toss it in the trash or keep it. On a whim, I decided to check if the class was still offered. To my surprise, it was, and a new session was starting the following week. Without giving it too much thought, I signed up. It was a small step, but it felt like a significant one, a way to start doing something for myself, to find a new passion, a new direction. The first class was held in a modest room at the community center, with a dozen or so other people, all of us strangers. The instructor, a woman named Rachel, was enthusiastic and approachable, her passion for photography infectious. We spent the first session learning about the basics, lighting, composition, and the importance of seeing the world through the lens in a different way. As I listened, I felt something stir inside me, a spark of interest I hadn't felt in a long time. Photography wasn't just about capturing moments. It was about seeing things differently and finding beauty in the everyday. It was about perspective, something I desperately needed to change. Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into the class, finding solace in the routine and the focus it required. I began to see the world in a new light, literally and figuratively. The camera became an extension of myself, a way to process everything I had been through. I spent hours wandering the city, capturing scenes that spoke to me, a child's laughter. The way the light hit a building at sunset, the quiet stillness of the early morning. One evening, after class, Rachel approached me as I was packing up my gear. "You've got a good eye, Jason," she said with a smile. "You should consider entering some of your work in our upcoming exhibition." I was taken aback. "An exhibition? I'm just a beginner. I don't think my work is anywhere near good enough." Rachel laughed softly. "You'd be surprised. Photography isn't just about technical skill. It's about capturing emotion and telling a story. And your photos do that. Think about it, okay?" I nodded, though I wasn't entirely convinced. But the idea stayed with me, nagging at the back of my mind. Maybe this was something I could do, something I could build on. Maybe this was the new beginning I had been searching for. The photography class and the potential exhibition gave me something to look forward to, something to strive for. But as fulfilling as it was, it also highlighted another void in my life. The lack of human connection. I had isolated myself after the divorce, retreating into my own world, but now I was starting to realize that I couldn't do this alone. I decided to reach out to people I had distanced myself from during the turmoil. One of the first calls I made was to my old college friend, Mark. We hadn't spoken in years, but I remembered him as someone who had always been grounded and reliable. He picked up on the second ring, his voice warm and familiar. "Jason. Man, it's been too long. How have you been?" We talked for hours, catching up on lost time. Mark had moved out of state but was planning to visit our hometown soon, and we made plans to meet up. It felt good to reconnect, to be reminded that there were still people in my life who cared, who had always been there, even when I had pushed them away. Over the next few weeks, I reconnected with more old friends, colleagues, and even family members I hadn't spoken to in a while. It wasn't easy, there were awkward moments and difficult conversations, but it was worth it. Slowly, I started to rebuild my social circle, to surround myself with people who supported me and wanted to see me succeed. One evening, after a particularly good photography session, I received an unexpected message. It was from Laura. I hadn't heard from her since the divorce was finalized, and seeing her name pop up on my phone was a jolt to the system. For a moment, I considered ignoring it, but curiosity got the better of me. "Hi, Jason," the message read. "I know it's been a while. And I'm not sure if you even want to hear from me, but I wanted to reach out. I've been doing a lot of thinking, a lot of reflecting on everything that happened. I don't expect forgiveness, but I do want to apologize, properly. If you're open to it, I'd like to meet and talk." I stared at the screen, emotions swirling. The idea of seeing her again, of dredging up all the pain, was daunting. But at the same time, there was a part of me that wanted closure, a part that needed to hear what she had to say. After a long moment, I typed out a reply, "Okay. Let's meet." We arranged to meet at a quiet cafe downtown, a neutral place where we could talk without the weight of the past hanging over us. As I sat there waiting, my heart pounded in my chest, the memories of everything that had happened flooding back. When Laura walked in, she looked different, tired, and older, as if the past few months had taken a toll on her, too. She spotted me and gave me a small, tentative smile before walking over. "Hi, Jason," she said quietly as she sat down. "Thank you for meeting with me." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak just yet. She looked down at her hands, which were clasped tightly on the table in front of her. "I've had a lot of time to think," she began, her voice soft. "And I realized I made the biggest mistake of my life. I betrayed you, and I betrayed myself. I was selfish, I was lost. And I know that doesn't excuse what I did, but I want you to know that I'm truly, deeply sorry." I listened, feeling the weight of her words. She seemed sincere, her remorse evident in every word. But I had been through too much to let her off easily. "Why now, Laura?" I asked, my voice steady. "Why reach out after all this time?" She looked up at me, her eyes filled with tears. "Because I needed to face what I did. I needed to take responsibility. I don't want to run from it anymore, and I don't want to run from you." There was a long silence as we both absorbed the gravity of the moment. I could see that she was hurting, that she had been through her own version of hell since everything had fallen apart. But I had to be honest with myself, and with her. "I appreciate the apology," I said finally. "And I believe you're sorry. But forgiveness, that's something I'm still working on. For now, I think it's best if we both focus on moving forward, separately." Laura nodded, wiping away a tear. "I understand. I just hope. I hope one day we can both find peace." I nodded, standing up to leave. "I hope so, too." As I walked out of the cafe, I felt a strange sense of closure. The meeting with Laura hadn't fixed anything, but it had given me something I hadn't realized I needed: an acknowledgement, a chance to confront the past and then leave it behind. For the first time since the day I discovered her betrayal, I felt like I could truly begin to heal. The road ahead was still uncertain, but it was mine to walk, and that was enough. The day of the photography exhibition arrived sooner than I expected. As I walked into the community center, I felt a mix of nerves and excitement. It had been months since I first picked up a camera, and now my work was about to be on display for the world, or at least a small part of it, to see. Rachel greeted me with a warm smile as I entered the gallery. The walls were lined with photographs, each one telling its own story. Mine were grouped together in a small section, and as I approached, I felt a surge of pride. The images I had chosen represented the journey I had been on, the pain, the growth, and the moments of clarity that had come in the wake of my broken marriage. One photo, in particular, stood out to me, a shot of a single tree in the middle of a vast field, its branches bare but strong, standing tall against the elements. I had taken it during a particularly difficult day, and to me, it symbolized resilience, the ability to endure even when everything around you seemed to be falling apart. People began to filter into the gallery, and soon the room was filled with the hum of conversation. I watched as visitors stopped to admire my work, their expressions thoughtful, and their reactions varied. It was surreal to see strangers connect with something that had been so personal to me. "Your work is incredible," a voice said beside me. I turned to see a woman standing there, her gaze fixed on the photo of the tree. "It's so raw, so emotional. You can really feel the story behind it." "Thank you," I replied, feeling a warmth spread through me. "That means a lot." We talked for a while, and I learned that her name was Megan. She was an artist herself, a painter, and she had been drawn to my work because of the emotions it evoked. We discussed our creative processes, the ways in which art could be a form of healing and a way to process and make sense of life's challenges. As the evening wore on, I found myself enjoying the exhibition more than I had expected. It wasn't just about the photographs. It was about the connections, the shared experiences, the realization that I wasn't alone in what I had gone through. Art had a way of bringing people together, of creating understanding where words sometimes failed. Before I left, Rachel pulled me aside. "I'm really proud of you, Jason," she said, her eyes sincere. "You've come a long way, and it shows in your work. Keep going. There's so much more for you to discover." I nodded, feeling a sense of accomplishment. The exhibition had been a milestone, a marker of how far I had come. But it was also a beginning, a new chapter in my life, one that was defined not by the pain of the past but by the possibilities of the future. The weeks following the exhibition were a blur of new experiences and budding possibilities. I continued to immerse myself in photography, finding joy in capturing the world around me. It became more than just a hobby. It was a passion, a way to express myself, to explore the emotions that still lingered beneath the surface. Megan and I started spending more time together. What began as a shared interest in art grew into something deeper, a connection that felt genuine and easy. We went on long walks, exploring the city with our cameras, talking about life, and gradually, she became someone I looked forward to seeing, someone who made the days brighter. One afternoon, as we sat in a park, watching the world go by, Megan turned to me with a thoughtful expression. "You know, Jason, you're not the same person you were when we first met. There's a lightness to you now, a sense of peace." I smiled, considering her words. "I think you're right. I've been through a lot, but I'm starting to feel like myself again. Or maybe a new version of myself, one who's learned from the past but isn't defined by it." Megan nodded, her eyes warm. "That's a beautiful thing. It's not easy to rebuild, but you're doing it. And you're doing it well." Her words stayed with me, a reminder of the progress I had made. The pain of the past hadn't disappeared, but it had become a part of my story, a chapter that I had learned from and moved on from. The future was still uncertain, but it was filled with promise, with the potential for new experiences, new relationships, and new beginnings. One evening, as I sat in my living room, the photo album I had kept from my marriage caught my eye. I hadn't opened it since the day I found it, but now, something compelled me to do so. I flipped through the pages, looking at the photos of Laura and me, the life we had once shared. There was no bitterness as I looked at those images, no anger. Instead, I felt a sense of closure, of acceptance. The man in those photos was different from the man I was now. He had been naive, perhaps, but he had also been hopeful, full of love and trust. And though that chapter had ended in betrayal, it had also led me to where I was now, a place of strength, of growth. I closed the album and set it aside, feeling a weight lift from my shoulders. I didn't need to cling to the past anymore. I was ready to let go, to fully embrace the future and whatever it held. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of anticipation. I had a shoot planned with Megan, something we had been talking about for weeks. As I got ready, I caught a glimpse of myself in the mirror, and for the first time in a long time, I liked what I saw. I was moving forward. I was living my life on my own terms, and it felt good. The road ahead was still unwritten, but that was okay. I was ready to face it, one step at a time, with a camera in hand and a newfound sense of purpose. Life was settling into a new rhythm. My photography was flourishing, and my relationship with Megan was growing stronger. But even as things were falling into place, there was still a lingering shadow from my past that I hadn't fully confronted. One day, out of the blue, I received a call from Laura's mother, Judith. We hadn't spoken since the divorce, and hearing her voice brought back a flood of memories. She sounded hesitant, almost nervous. "Jason," she began, "I hope you don't mind me reaching out. I've been thinking about you, and I wanted to see how you were doing." "I'm okay," I replied cautiously, unsure of where this conversation was heading. "How about you?" "I've been managing," she said, her voice heavy with emotion. "Listen, I don't know if Laura told you, but she's been struggling since the divorce. She's not the same, Jason. She's lost, and I think she's finally realizing the weight of what she did." I didn't know how to respond. Part of me felt a pang of sympathy, but another part was still guarded, protective of the progress I had made. Judith continued, sensing my hesitation. "I'm not asking for anything," she said quickly. I think it would help her to see you, to talk to you. She's been going to therapy, and her therapist suggested that she reach out to make amends. But she's too afraid, too ashamed." I sighed, feeling a mix of emotions. "Judith, I've moved on. I don't know if reopening that wound is a good idea." "I understand," she replied softly. "But sometimes, confronting the past is the only way to truly move forward. I'm not asking you to forgive her, Jason. Just consider it. For both your sakes." After we hung up, I sat with her words for a long time. The idea of meeting Laura again, of facing the pain she had caused, was daunting. But Judith was right. There was still a part of me that hadn't fully let go, a part that needed closure, not just for me but for Laura as well. A few days later, I found myself driving to the old cafe where Laura and I used to go on Sunday mornings. It was neutral ground, a place that held memories but wasn't tainted by the bitterness of our divorce. I had texted Laura to meet me there, and though her response had been cautious, she had agreed. When I arrived, Laura was already there, sitting at a table near the window, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee. She looked up as I walked in, her eyes wide with a mix of surprise and apprehension. "Jason," she said, standing up awkwardly. "Thank you for coming." I nodded, taking a seat across from her. The tension was palpable, the air thick with unspoken words. For a moment, we just sat there, neither of us knowing how to begin. Finally, Laura broke the silence. "I'm sorry for how things ended between us," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I know I hurt you more than I can ever make up for, and I don't expect you to forgive me. But I need you to know that I'm working on myself, that I'm trying to be better, to understand why I did what I did." I looked at her, seeing the sincerity in her eyes. She had changed. There was a vulnerability to her now that hadn't been there before. It was clear that the past year had taken its toll on her, just as it had on me. "I've moved on, Laura," I said, my voice steady. "But that doesn't mean I don't still carry the scars. What you did, it broke me. It made me question everything. But I've realized that holding on to that anger, that pain, it's not helping either of us. I'm willing to hear you out, to understand, but that's all I can offer. Laura nodded, her eyes welling up with tears. That's more than I deserve, Jason. I just want you to know that I regret everything, every lie, every betrayal. I lost myself, and in doing so, I lost you, too. I don't expect anything from you, but I want you to know that I'm trying to make amends, not just with you, but with myself. We talked for a while, and as difficult as it was, it felt necessary. There were tears, apologies, and moments of silence as we both processed the enormity of what had happened. It wasn't easy, but by the time we parted ways, I felt a sense of closure that I hadn't thought possible. As I drove away from the cafe, I realized that meeting with Laura had been the final step in my journey of healing. It hadn't erased the past, but it had allowed me to finally close that chapter of my life. I had faced the darkness and confronted the pain, and now, I was ready to move forward, unburdened by the weight of what had been. With the confrontation with Laura behind me, I felt a renewed sense of clarity and purpose. The past no longer held its grip on me, and I was free to fully embrace the future. My photography continued to be a source of joy and fulfillment, and I found myself exploring new creative avenues, pushing the boundaries of what I thought was possible. One evening, after a particularly rewarding day of shooting, Megan and I sat on the rooftop of her apartment building, the city skyline spread out before us. The sun was setting, casting a warm, golden light over everything, and the moment felt perfect, like a culmination of everything I had been working towards. You've been different lately, Megan said, breaking the comfortable silence between us. Lighter. Happier. I feel different, I admitted, smiling at her. I think meeting with Laura was the final piece of the puzzle. I've let go of the past, and now, I'm focused on the future, on us, on my work, on everything that lies ahead. Megan reached over and took my hand, her touch warm and reassuring. I'm glad. You deserve to be happy, Jason. And I'm excited to see where this journey takes you. We sat there for a while, watching the sun dip below the horizon, the city lights beginning to twinkle in the distance. It was a moment of peace, of contentment, and I knew that I was exactly where I was meant to be. In the weeks that followed, I continued to explore new opportunities in my photography. I started working on a new project, one that focused on the theme of resilience, capturing stories of people who had overcome adversity and who had found strength in the face of hardship. It was a project that resonated deeply with me, and I poured my heart and soul into it. The project gained traction, and soon I was approached by a gallery interested in showcasing my work. It was an incredible opportunity, one that I hadn't dared to dream of when I first picked up a camera. The exhibition was scheduled for the following spring, and I threw myself into the preparation, determined to make it the best work I had ever done. Megan was by my side every step of the way, offering support, encouragement, and creative input. Our relationship had deepened, and I realized that I had found something truly special with her, something that was built on trust, understanding, and mutual respect. One evening, as we were going through some of my latest photos, Megan turned to me with a thoughtful expression. Jason, have you ever thought about teaching? You have so much experience now, and I think you'd be great at helping others find their creative voice. The idea caught me off guard. Teaching had never crossed my mind. But the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. I had learned so much on my journey, and the thought of sharing that knowledge with others, of helping them find their own path, was appealing. I hadn't considered it, I admitted. But now that you mention it, it does sound like something I'd enjoy. Megan smiled, her eyes bright with excitement. I think you should go for it. You've come so far, Jason, and you have so much to offer. Imagine the impact you could have on others, helping them discover their own passion for photography. The more we talked about it, the more the idea took root. I began to explore the possibility, looking into teaching opportunities at local community centers and schools. It felt like a natural progression, a way to give back, and to use my experiences to help others find their way. As the weeks turned into months, I started teaching a beginner's photography class at the same community center where I had taken my first lessons. It was a full circle moment. And as I stood in front of my first group of students, I felt a deep sense of fulfillment. I was doing something meaningful, something that connected me to others in a way I hadn't expected. The class was a success, and I found that I loved teaching. Watching my students grow and seeing the spark of creativity ignite in them was incredibly rewarding. It was another step on my journey, another way to move forward, to continue evolving. Life had taken me down a path I never could have predicted. The pain of betrayal, the darkness of those early days, now seemed like a distant memory, something that had shaped me but no longer defined me. I had found my way out of the shadows, and now, I was living in the light, pursuing my passions, building a future with Megan, and helping others discover the joy of photography. The road ahead was still unwritten, but for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to face it with open arms, excited for whatever lay ahead. The morning of the gallery exhibition dawned bright and clear, the crisp air carrying a sense of anticipation. As I stood in front of the mirror, adjusting my tie, I couldn't help but reflect on how far I'd come. This exhibition wasn't just another display of photographs. It was the culmination of a journey that had started in darkness and led me into the light. Megan stood beside me, radiant in a simple yet elegant dress. She gave me an encouraging smile. "Ready for this?" I nodded, feeling a mixture of excitement and nerves. As ready as I'll ever be. It feels like everything has been leading to this moment. We arrived at the gallery to find it buzzing with activity. The walls were adorned with my photographs, each one telling a story of resilience, hope, and the strength to rebuild. There were images of people who had faced challenges and come out stronger, landscapes that symbolized endurance, and even a few shots that were deeply personal, snapshots of my own journey. As guests began to arrive, I moved through the gallery, greeting them and answering questions about my work. The response was overwhelmingly positive, and I felt a swell of pride with each compliment and each word of encouragement. It was validation not just of my art but of the choices I had made and the path I had walked to get here. Midway through the evening, as I was speaking with a group of visitors, I caught sight of someone I hadn't expected to see, Laura. She stood near the entrance, looking uncertain, her eyes scanning the room until they found me. Our gazes locked, and for a moment, everything else faded away. Excusing myself from the conversation, I made my way over to her. She looked different, more composed, more at peace. It had been months since our meeting at the cafe, and seeing her now, I could tell that she, too, had been on her own journey of healing. "Jason," she said softly, her voice carrying a mix of emotions. "Your work is incredible. I wanted to come and see it for myself, to see how far you've come." "Thank you, Laura," I replied, genuinely touched by her words. "It means a lot that you're here." She nodded, her eyes lingering on the photographs around us. "You've found something special, something that speaks to people. I can see how much you've grown, how much you've changed." "I have," I said, glancing at the images on the walls. "This exhibition is more than just a collection of photos. It's a reflection of everything I've been through, everything I've learned." Laura looked at me with a sincerity that was hard to ignore. "I'm glad you found your way, Jason. And I'm sorry, again, for everything. I'm working on finding my own path, but I wanted you to know that I'm proud of you." I smiled, feeling a sense of closure. "Thank you, Laura. I wish you the best, too. We both deserve to be happy, to move forward." With that, she gave me a small smile, one that seemed to carry a sense of finality, and then she turned and walked away, disappearing into the crowd. It was a brief encounter, but it felt significant, like the last piece of a puzzle clicking into place. The rest of the evening passed in a whirlwind of conversations and congratulations. By the time the last guest had left and the gallery was quiet again, I felt an overwhelming sense of fulfillment. This exhibition had been more than just a professional achievement. It was a personal victory, a testament to the strength I had found within myself. As Megan and I stood in the empty gallery, surrounded by my photographs, she turned to me with a smile.
You did it, Jason. You've come full circle.
Dot.
I nodded, feeling a deep sense of contentment. Yeah, I guess I have. And I couldn't have done it without you.
She wrapped her arms around me, and we stood there for a moment, just soaking in the significance of it all. The journey hadn't been easy, but it had been worth it.
I had faced my demons, found my passion, and discovered love again. And now, standing in that gallery, I knew that I was finally where I was meant to be. The night air was cool as we stepped outside, the city lights twinkling around us.
As we walked down the street, hand in hand, I felt a sense of peace, of closure. The past was behind me, and the future was wide open, filled with endless possibilities. And as we turned the corner, disappearing into the night, I knew that whatever came next, I was ready. Ready to embrace it, to live it fully, to continue this journey of life, love, and creativity.
I had found my way, and now, there was no looking back.